sales pitch was irresistible. Tired of the same old beaches, bored of historical landmarks you can only read about, Chrono Safari offers an experience that transcends time itself. Witness the dawn of the terrible lizards, walk among giants, and see a world untouched by human hands. It was the ultimate luxury, the pinnacle of adventure tourism. For a price that could buy a small island, the megacorporation Chrono Corp promised a week-long, fully catered, and perfectly safe tour of the late Jurassic period. The passengers were a motley crew of the ultra-rich. There was a tech billionaire, a reclusive author, a thrill-seeking heiress, and a family who had won the trip in a highly publicized lottery. They were promised the spectacle of a lifetime. What they got was something far more primal. This is the story of their final journey, pieced together from the fragmented data logs of their tour vessel, the Temporal Ark. This is the last broadcast. The arrival was everything they had been promised, and more. The Temporal Ark materialized with a gentle hum, not in a sterile landing zone, but hovering silently over a vast primordial floodplain. The air that filtered into the observation deck was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth, exotic blossoms, and something else, something wild and musky. Giant dragonflies with iridescent wings buzzed past the reinforced plexiglass, and in the distance a herd of brachiosaurs moved like living mountains, their long necks swaying rhythmically as they stripped leaves from towering cycads. The initial data logs are filled with breathless descriptions. The tech billionaire, a man named Kaito, is heard laughing. This is better than any VR simulation. The resolution is infinite. The author, a woman named Alara, is more poetic, her voice a hushed whisper. It's a world painted in greens and browns, a world of impossible scale. We are but ants in the garden of giants. For the first 24 hours, everything went according to plan. The Ark followed a pre-programmed route, its advanced cloaking technology rendering it invisible and silent to the prehistoric inhabitants. The tourists were treated to breathtaking sights, a stegosaurus herd with their iconic plates gleaming in the sun, a family of agile Compsognathus skittering through the undergrowth, and the graceful long-tailed Ramphorhynchus soaring through the humid air. The first sign of trouble was subtle, a flicker in the lights, a slight shudder that ran through the deck plating. The ship's AI, a calm, reassuring voice named Plato, announced a minor temporal fluctuation. "Nothing to be concerned about," it chirped, a common side effect of navigating Chronoton fields. But the tour guide, a grizzled ex-Special Forces soldier named Rex, a man who had seen too much in too many timelines, looked uneasy. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the instruments with a practiced intensity. Then came the second shudder, much more violent this time. Alarms, a sound no one on this luxury tour ever expected to hear, blared through the vessel. Red lights washed over the pristine white interior, casting long, dancing shadows. Plato's voice, now strained and glitching, sputtered, warning catastrophic temporal cascade failure. The view outside the observation deck began to spin wildly. The lush green landscape blurred into a vortex of color and light. The temporal arc, the pinnacle of human engineering, was out of control. The crash was definitive, a gut-wrenching screech of tearing metal, a bone-jarring impact, and then silence. A silence broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the panicked breaths of the survivors. The temporal arc had sliced through the canopy of a dense, swampy forest, its sleek form now a broken, twisted wreck. The aft section was completely sheared off, and the invisible cloaking field was offline. They were exposed. Rex was the first to his feet, his training kicking in. A quick head count revealed the grim reality. Half the passengers and crew were gone, lost in the crash. The survivors were a motley bunch: Rex, Kaito the billionaire, Elara the author, the lottery-winning family, a father named Ben, his wife Sarah, and their teenage son Leo, and a nervous, perpetually sweating Chronocorp technician named Wallace. Their multi-million-dollar pleasure cruise had become a desperate fight for survival 150 million years from home. The first night was a symphony of terror. The jungle, which had seemed so beautiful from the safety of the ark, was now a wall of oppressive darkness, alive with sounds that clawed at the edges of their sanity. Every rustle in the giant ferns, every guttural call from the canopy, every splash in the nearby swamp was a potential threat. They huddled in the wreckage, the emergency lights of the ark casting a feeble glow against the immense, encroaching blackness. It was Kaito who cracked first. "We have to do something," he yelled, his voice a high-pitched, panicked squeal. "My company is worth trillions. I can't die here." Rex, ever the pragmatist, silenced him with a cold stare. "Your money is worthless here," he growled. "What matters now is staying quiet and staying alive." Alara, meanwhile, was documenting everything in her notebook, her writer's mind trying to process the unfolding nightmare. "The air hums," she wrote, her handwriting shaky. "It's an electric feeling, the feeling of being prey." At dawn, Wallace, the technician, delivered the bad news. "The temporal drive is atomized," he stammered, his face pale. "There's no way to repair it. The long-range comms are shot too. But," he hesitated, "the emergency beacon on the primary escape pod might still be functional. It's designed to send a distress signal across temporal streams. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, flickered among the survivors. The escape pod was in the ark's nose section, which had broken off and skidded nearly a kilometer through the swamp. The journey to the escape pod was their only chance. Rex laid out the grim reality. They would have to travel on foot through a world that had not seen a human being in its entire existence. They were slow, soft, and utterly defenseless. Armed with salvaged tools and pieces of the ark's hull, they stepped out of the wreckage and into the Jurassic. The air was thick with humidity, the ground a treacherous mix of mud and tangled roots. The world felt ancient, and they, in their futuristic, tattered clothes, were an anachronism, an aberration that nature would surely seek to correct. The first encounter was with one of the smaller predators, a pair of Dilophosaurus, not the giant, frilled movie monsters, but lean, fast, and unsettlingly intelligent creatures emerged from the ferns 3. They were beautiful, in a terrifying way, with vibrant crests and eyes that seemed to watch the survivors with a chilling curiosity. They circled the group, their bird-like movements jerky and unpredictable, letting out a series of high-pitched, chittering calls. It was Ben, the lottery-winning father, who panicked. He let out a yell and threw a rock at one of the creatures. It was a fatal mistake. The Dilophosaurus, provoked, spat a thick, black, viscous venom that narrowly missed Leo. In the ensuing chaos, Rex managed to drive them back with a flaring emergency torch, but the message was clear. They were not just observers anymore, they were on the menu. The incident left them shaken, and the once cohesive family unit began to fray, Sarah clutching Leo tightly, her eyes filled with a new, raw fear. Their journey took them through a graveyard of giants, a vast, open plain littered with the colossal skeletons of sauropods picked clean by scavengers. The sheer scale of the bones was humbling, a stark reminder of the immense power that had once animated these creatures. It was here that they saw the king, an Allosaurus, a predator almost as large as a T-Rex but leaner, more agile, was feasting on a fresh kill. It was a scene of brutal natural violence. The creature's massive jaws tore through flesh and bone with sickening ease, its roar echoing across the plains, a sound that vibrated deep in their chests. They hid among the skeletal remains of a long-dead giant scarcely daring to breathe as the Allosaurus patrolled its territory. Kaito, for all his bluster, was reduced to a whimpering mess, stuffing a corner of his expensive jacket into his mouth to stifle his sobs. Leo, the teenager, however, was mesmerized. He watched the creature with a strange mixture of terror and fascination, a grim understanding of the world they were now in dawning on his young face. This was nature, raw and unfiltered, a spectacle far more real than any video game he had ever played. Humor, even in the darkest of times, has a way of bubbling to the surface. As they navigated a particularly dense patch of jungle, Wallace, the technician, tripped and fell headfirst into a patch of what looked like giant prehistoric mushrooms. He came up sputtering, covered in a fine purple powder. For a moment everyone froze, expecting the worst. Then Wallace sneezed, a comical, echoing sound that seemed utterly out of place. A few seconds later he began to giggle, a low, soft chuckle that soon erupted into uncontrollable laughter. The purple spores, it turned out, were a potent, if short-lived, hallucinogen. For the next hour, Wallace was in his own little world, pointing at the sky and describing pixelated pterodactyls and the sound of the color blue. It was a moment of absurd, surreal levity in the midst of their terror. Even Rex cracked a smile. It was a brief respite, a reminder of the strange, unpredictable nature of this lost world, and of the fragile human minds trying to cope with it. The respite was short-lived. As they neared the location of the escape pod, they entered a new kind of hell, a network of ravines, a maze of rock and shadow, and this was a hunting ground. The raptors found them here. Not the oversized movie monsters, but smaller, more terrifyingly plausible utahraptors. They were pack hunters, moving with a fluid, coordinated grace that spoke of terrifying intelligence. They didn't attack immediately. They stalked. A flash of movement on a ridge above, a shadow darting between boulders, a single sickle-shaped claw tapping impatiently on a rock. The tension became unbearable. Every sound, every gust of wind was a potential attack. It was a war of nerves, and the raptors were masters of it. Rex knew they were being herded, pushed towards a kill zone. "They're playing with us," he whispered, his voice grim. "They're enjoying this." It was Kaito who finally broke. With a scream of pure terror, he bolted, trying to scramble up the side of the ravine. It was exactly what the raptors had been waiting for. The attack was swift, brutal, and chillingly efficient. The raptors descended on Kaito like a force of nature. His screams were cut short with terrifying finality. The rest of the survivors could only watch in horror, frozen in place. The raptors didn't just kill, they communicated, they strategized, they celebrated their victory with a series of sharp, barking calls that echoed through the ravine. It was an execution. But Kaito's desperate, foolish act had an unintended consequence. It bought the others time. As the raptors were distracted by their kill, Rex grabbed the others and pushed them forward. "Don't look back! Move!" he roared. They ran, stumbling and falling through the winding canyons, the sounds of the raptors' feast fading behind them. They had escaped, but at a terrible cost. They were fewer, and the psychological scars were deep. The illusion of safety was shattered forever. They were no longer tourists. They were just prey. They found the nose of the Ark at the edge of a great, steaming caldera, a place of geothermal vents and bubbling mud pits. The escape pod was still intact, a small, silver lining in a world of gray despair. But as Wallace worked frantically to power it up, a new, more colossal threat emerged. The ground began to tremble, not with the familiar tremors of the caldera, but with heavy, rhythmic thuds, thuds that grew closer and closer. From the mists of the geothermal field, a vast shape began to resolve, taller than the trees, with a head the size of a small car, and a maw filled with teeth like railroad spikes, a Tyrannosaurus Rex. It wasn't just big, it was a force of nature, an apex predator at the zenith of its power. It let out a roar, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, a concussive blast of sound that rattled their bones and shook the very air they breathed. The raptors were cunning hunters. This was a god. What followed was not a fight, but a desperate, chaotic scramble for survival. The T-Rex wasn't just hunting, it was asserting its dominance, enraged by the intrusion into its territory. It stomped, it roared, it smashed its massive head against the wreckage of the Ark, sending shrapnel flying. The family, Ben, Sarah, and Leo, were separated from the others in the chaos. Rex, Ilara, and Wallace scrambled towards the escape pod, the ground shaking with each of the Titan's steps. Just as Wallace managed to power up the beacon, the T-Rex's massive foot came down, narrowly missing him but crushing the Ark's wreckage he had been using for cover. He was thrown clear, his datapad skittering across the muddy ground. Meanwhile, Ben, in a final, heroic act of paternal sacrifice, drew the creature's attention, giving Sarah and Leo a precious few seconds to find cover in a deep crevice. The last thing they saw of him was his small, defiant figure, swallowed by the colossal shadow of the beast. Rex and Ilara managed to drag the injured Wallace into the escape pod. The hatch hissed shut, sealing them inside a tiny metal coffin. Through the small viewport, they watched as the T-Rex, its rage seemingly spent, moved on. The world outside was once again quiet, save for the bubbling of the mud pits and the hiss of the steam vents. Inside there was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the steady, hopeful ping of the distress beacon. The final entry on Ilara's recovered notebook, found clutched in her hand, is almost illegible. It's quiet now. The monster has gone. Wallace is hurt, but alive. Rex, he just stares out the viewport. The beacon is on. Will anyone hear it? Does anyone even exist in the future we left behind? Or are we just a ghost story, waiting to be told? We traded our world for this one. And this world is hungry. The beacon continued to pulse, a tiny electronic heartbeat in a land of thunderous footsteps, a signal in a bottle cast out across an ocean of time. The signal from the Chrono Safari escape pod, designated Archie-P01, was eventually received, not in a day, not in a year, but centuries later, by a deep-time archaeological probe. A recovery mission was launched, but when they arrived at the coordinates, they found only the escape pod, empty and weathered by time. The hatch was open. Of Rex, Ilara, and Wallace, there was no sign.